Hi, everyone, and welcome back. I should probably warn you that this week's episode is basically me taking one innocent little question that I asked last week and overthinking it for the next 15 minutes. But judging by the messages some of you sent me this week, I know I'm not doing the overthinking alone. That seemingly simple question received far more compliments than I expected, so thank you for that. My brain, which came up with it and has spent an unreasonable amount of time thinking about it since, appreciates all the praise. So let's get into it. Last week's question was: would you rather be the most interesting person in a room full of boring people or the most boring person in a room full of interesting people? Now, before I got to your answers, I realized we all had to agree on one word: interesting. Because interesting is not the same as intelligent. Someone can be incredibly intelligent and still not be someone I personally find interesting. And equally, someone I find incredibly interesting might not be the most intelligent person in the room. Those two are not the same things. And this needs to be clear. For example, someone who spent 30 years researching corals and is the leading expert might be the most fascinating person to another marine biologist or someone who's just interested in the environment. To me, I know exactly how long that conversation is lasting. On the other hand, I once found myself chatting to someone I had just met because my friend had stepped away to take a phone call. She was a makeup artist who traveled around India for work. And suddenly I had 100 questions. How do you build a career like that? How do you find clients? Are there websites where people book you? How often do you travel? Do you partner with other people like the hairstylist and the sari draper when you travel? Do they come with you? Or do you find someone local every time? The list of questions was long. And I walked away thinking that was such an interesting conversation, which is funny because I actually find makeup incredibly boring. I'm famously known for wearing very little of it, but somehow that conversation was interesting. It opened a door into a world I knew absolutely nothing about, which I found quite fascinating. Which then made me wonder whether interesting people even exist, or whether interesting conversations happen because someone asks the right questions. Then one of my friends said something that completely changed how I looked at this question. She pointed out that even within our own group of four friends, we have naturally formed these little pockets of conversation. She and I can happily spend an hour talking about Formula One, feminism, current affairs, or whatever ridiculous thing has happened in pop culture that week. Then she'll spend time with our second friend talking about hot men, marriage, speaking in completely ridiculous accents, and laughing at jokes that only the two of them seem to understand. And then finally, with the third friend, she'll disappear into a conversation about BTS. Now, they have done their best to recruit me over the years, and to be fair, they've been partially successful. I know all the seven members, I have a few of the songs on my playlist, but my capacity for obsessive fandom was allocated to Novak Djokovic decades ago, who, by the way, as I record this, is in a fierce suicide battle, and I hope he wins. But I digress. And the point being, I don't have the time to have that conversation about BTS. So none of us are pretending to be interested in every conversation, and none of us are trying to convince the others to like the same things. We just naturally are drifting towards these conversations, the ones we enjoy, and then we drift back together again as a collective. Listening to this logic made me wonder about something else. If I am boring in a room that interests me, maybe that is because something in me refuses to stay bored. I have to go find the interesting part, even if it is buried somewhere I was not expecting. That search is its own kind of motivation. And maybe that is where the learning happens, not in the topic itself, but in the fact that I went looking for a way in. But what if someone never goes looking? What if they, the most boring person in a room, simply stay boring because nothing in them is pushing to search for the interesting part? I do not think that person walks away having learned anything. Not because their room failed them, but because they were never curious. So maybe growth does not come from the room being interesting. Maybe it comes from whatever is in you that refuses to let a room stay boring. Then again, maybe that's not true either. What if someone is just quiet, an introvert, not because they lack the motivation, but who learns by absorption rather than by asking questions? They might not say a word all evening and still walk away, having picked up more than anyone else in that room simply by observing. So maybe growth does not always come from searching out loud. Sometimes it comes from refusing to stay bored. Sometimes it comes from quietly absorbing everyone and everything around you. And sometimes, if neither is happening, probably nothing changes at all. Maybe there is not one room. Maybe if all four of us answered this question, we would all be imagining completely different rooms. Maybe, and I know there have been many maybes, interesting is not something a person is. Maybe it is something that exists between people. It is the overlap. With that in mind, I finally looked at all your answers. What surprised me was that most of you chose the same room. It was that almost none of you chose it for the same reason. In fact, only one person chose to be the most interesting person in a room full of boring people. And I loved her answer. She joked that she had spent enough time feeling like she was not the interesting person in the room, and now she would actually quite like people to look at her, look up to her for a change. We laughed, but underneath the joke, I thought there was something really honest. Sometimes you're not answering the question in front of us. We're answering based on experiences we've already had. Maybe she had spent enough time feeling overlooked. This was not really about boring people at all. Maybe it was about finally wanting to feel seen. Everyone else, though, chose the second room. But even this, they were not choosing it for the same reason. A couple of you chose the room because you wanted to learn. One person said they would happily stay quiet, listen, and hopefully one day become confident enough to join the conversation. I think I love that answer a lot because they were not imagining themselves as the most boring person forever. They imagined growing in this room. Then there was another group of you who said something I'd not expected at all. You did not choose the second room because of learning. You chose it because the first room sounded exhausting. One of you said being the most interesting person would put immense pressure on you. Another said it's easier to speak less. I had not even considered that. Being the interesting one suddenly comes with expectations. You have to have the stories, you have to keep the conversation going, you have to somehow live up to that title. Then there was another answer that completely changed my own answer. Someone said, I'm deeply torn because I have this need for external validation, and I'm not getting that in either of those situations. But even with that, I would still choose the second room full of interesting people because even though they may find me boring, I'd still be entertained. In the first room, I'd probably lose interest and probably shut down. When I first wrote this question, I thought my answer was that I would choose the second room because it would give me a benchmark. I would know where I stood, I would know how interesting I really was. But then I realized something else. If I am the benchmark, that means I already know how to tell a good story. So if everyone else in that room is more interesting than me, their stories are probably even better than mine. Which means I'm not walking into a room to feel small. I'm walking into a room that is guaranteed to entertain me. Now, that might be a very generous assumption to make about myself, but it is one I'm comfortable sitting with. And so I agree with this listener who said that she would shut down in a room filled with boring people and she'd actually be entertained in the other room. And so I think my answer changed to match hers. I'm looking for a room that makes me curious and that keeps making me curious. Now, for one final thing. One thing that I observed was that nobody who chose the second room imagined staying the most boring person forever. Not one. Everyone imagined what that room would do to them. One imagined learning, one imagined eventually finding the confidence to speak, one imagined simply enjoying listening. I imagined never getting bored, but none of us imagined staying exactly as we were. which made me wonder whether we were not actually choosing to be the most boring person at all. Maybe we were choosing the possibility of becoming more interesting. Or maybe we simply believed that the people around us would change us. But then I caught myself thinking about the other side of it. Because we have spent a lot of time talking about the pressure that comes with being the most interesting person in the room. What we've not really spoken about is the pressure that comes with always being the most boring. If you spent years in that room, would you eventually start wondering whether your life was interesting enough? Whether you had done enough? Whether your stories were worth telling? Whether you really belonged there at all? Maybe you would become more confident because of the people around you. Or maybe you would slowly convince yourself that you would never quite catch up. Now, I do not know. Maybe that is the trade off. One room asks you, can I keep living up to everyone's expectations? And then the other one asks you, will I ever feel like I belong? And that left me with one final question. This is just about one evening. Or is it about just one evening? Because I have a feeling that if it were a longer duration, it might change your answer. What if you had to stay in that room for the next 10 years? Would you still choose the same room or would your answer change? I'd genuinely love to know. With that said, I think I've probably overthought one question enough for 1 week and said the word interesting a million times and the word maybe 5 million times. Just kidding. But what that means is now it's time for the achievement of the week. This week's achievement has been to give myself a break. It turns out that it is much harder than it sounds and it makes you feel really guilty. But I baked a lemon cake, I met a friend, I slowly made my way towards finishing the TV show Veera, which has become one of those shows I don't actually want to end, but I'm on the final season, so I'm a little sad about that. And for the first time in a while, I tried not to feel guilty for not constantly trying to be productive. I think I'm going to count that as an achievement. Sometimes surviving is an achievement, and sometimes resting is enough. And sometimes making a lemon cake counts as productivity. I'm choosing to believe that. Now, for next week's question. I watched Voicemails for Isabel a couple of weeks ago, and the first 10 minutes made me bawl. I was a mess to say the least. So, I've been kind of living in the warmth of it ever since, and it got me thinking about something I want to explore with all of you. So, next week's question is, what's your favorite sibling relationship in a film, TV show, or book, and why is that? As always, I'm far more interested in the why than the answer itself. I have a feeling I'm going to get introduced to a lot of stories and characters I probably have not met, and I'm really looking forward to that. Until then, thanks for listening. Hope you all have a great week. See you soon. Bye bye.